She has stepped into the role of CEO with a charity that has a focus on helping young people navigate grief, as well as adults on how to help their younger loved ones get through a loss. Suzy talks to us about the implications if you don't address this grief and the ways in which the right support can really shape the development of a young person. I am very pleased to welcome Suzy.
When you're a child and you don't have the language to express that, or you haven't developed the concept of understanding that something may never come back, all of those things are hugely complicating the grief process. And one of the most healing things to do is to make sure that you remember that relationship and you nurture it and you keep it alive, and encouraging children to talk about the person that's died, to share memories and feelings and stories will be healing. Even when you cook and you bake and you add all the ingredients together, you make a tremendous loaf and then you eat it and it's gone. And I think, you're so right. So children are having those experiences of something being here and then something growing and then something being gone. And I think the most important thing we can do as adults is make sure we're clear about what we mean by when something has gone. What we hear children say to us all the time was that they stopped talking about the person that died because they didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And that meant for them very often that they really suppressed their feelings, and they may have taken up other behaviours that felt soothing to them. And we very often see that where a significant grief has left unresolved, a young person may turn to riskier taking behaviours to self-soothe, say via alcohol, substance misuse, and even really in pursuing relationships that are perhaps not the right ones or the healthiest ones for them.
My name is Claudia Green, and this is She Did That, the podcast shining a spotlight on remarkable women who are breaking barriers and proving that greatness knows no gender. From female founders who have raised millions of pounds, the investors changing the landscape as we know it, to survivors of tragedy who have achieved the amazing, and many more. We will share the stories of these incredible women who will inspire and empower you. In order to support us and these women, please subscribe on your viewing or listening channel of choice so we can continue our mission of sharing the stories that should and need to be heard.
This week I have Suzy Turner-Jones, the CEO of Grief Encounter. After years of working in clinical roles with social services, charitable organisations and educational institutes, she has stepped into the role of CEO with a charity that has a focus on helping young people navigate grief, as well as adults on how to help their younger loved ones get through a loss. Suzy talks to us about the implications if you don't address this grief and the ways in which the right support can really shape the development of a young person. I am very pleased to welcome Suzy. Thank you so much for being here, Suzy. Pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
This subject today is obviously a little bit different. I think it's really important to highlight your journey and how you got to where you are right now before delving into the work that you do with Grief Encounter. So why don't you start by telling me sort of where did your career start out and kind of the roots to where we are now?
Okay. I think when I was at school, I was always encouraged, and I think it was almost expected for me to become a shorthand typist. And I did do shorthand and typing, but I never became a shorthand typist. I went into working originally for a doctor's surgery as a bilingual medical secretary.
Oh dear.
Yeah, and I realised very quickly that the thing that was keeping me there was working with people. And after I had my own young family, I decided that I would go back to university as a mature student and study to become a primary school teacher. I got my first foundation degree in early childhood studies with human science. But when I went on to do my PGCE, I quickly realised I was much more interested in the children's well-being than I was perhaps their ability to add up or read. And I thought, well, they'll all love me, but I don't think I'll get the results that their parents would be hoping for. and I left and decided to pursue a career working with some of the more vulnerable children and young people. And I went to work for Children's Social Care, delivering family support for some of the most vulnerable children and young people living in extreme circumstances of poverty or neglect and at some levels abuse. And I loved that career. I knew I was in the right place, and I knew I wanted to do that from the perspective of helping families. All families go through trials and tribulations, and my heart really was full of trying to not just protect children, but to keep them where they thrive best, which is in their own homes. I did that for a long while and eventually ended up in the voluntary sector. And I didn't want to go. I went a bit kicking and screaming. I was probably institutionalised, and I kind of thought the world would implode. And I went into the voluntary sector and I never looked back. I didn't realise how creative you could be. And I had a career there. I started off working for an organisation in Suffolk called the Ormiston Trust. We set up a long time ago support services for children with emerging emotional and behavioural difficulties. And I then went on to run some Sure Start local programmes and eventually ended up with Barnardo's. I had a long career with Barnardo's, and who were absolutely tremendous at investing in children and young people, but also in ways to work differently to make the biggest impact. And I was able to bring social pedagogy into children's homes and work differently with children with disabilities, and also children who were struggling with mental health. And from there, I knew I had had an enormously wonderful opportunity there. Barnardo's was a learning organisation, still is, and they taught you to be entrepreneurial and to think about things, making a change to society, but in a way that is about being able to deliver an entire service. So I then did what many people did, which is I left Barnardo's to pursue a more senior role, but in a smaller organisation. And the job of Director of Clinical Services came up at Grief Encounter. I have to say, when I first looked at it, I kind of thought, is this for me? And as I delved deeper, I realised that my early career, right from the beginning of my very first job, was as a consequence of the death of my dearest friend's brother, who died far too early. He was 16 when he was diagnosed with cancer, and he died by the time he was 19. Oh my goodness. And it was his death that spurred me on to become a volunteer. I volunteered for Macmillan nurses for a long time. And it was that volunteering that led me to be able to think about and demonstrate experience of working with some of the most vulnerable people.
And does it get quite difficult? I mean, obviously we're different, so maybe it would be not a great role for me. But I always think, are there not times where you're really tempted to cross boundaries? Like if you're working with a child who is really struggling, and you get to know them quite well, where do you know where to draw the line there in terms of being a clinician, being a support, to being a friend to them?
I think absolutely there are times when you want to cross boundaries, and I think I learned that lesson very, very early on. I was working with a young child. She was just 9 months old, and she was struggling to thrive under the care of her parent. And she went into kinship care with her grandparents, and I would take her every week to have contact with her mother. And I kind of thought in my own world that she would just love to come home with me. But she really never did, because the person that she wanted to be with was Mum. And the place where she was happiest was when she was with Mum. And I think I learnt that very, very early on, that where children want to be is where they were born and where they grew up. Even in some of the most difficult of circumstances, you can't replace somebody's roots and their foundations for life, even though sometimes they're not good enough, and children need to be protected and cared for elsewhere. Learning that you are there to help and enable rather than to rush in and rescue is critical to your success as a practitioner with children, young people and families.
Yeah, I think if it was me, I'd be like, do you want to come home with me? Why don't you just sleep over for a few days? If I saw a really upset child, and I think I would struggle to draw that line, especially if, presumably you can get quite attached. You spend a lot of time with these children. Yeah. And it must be quite difficult to sort of just...
I think if you weren't attached, you wouldn't be good at your job. You need to be attached, you need to have empathy and compassion, but you're not a part of their family, and it's your job to maintain calmness and to be calm and quiet and confident and able to observe and listen to some of the most devastating of stories in a way that doesn't, where you don't freak out so that they don't freak out, in a way that you just demonstrate acceptance and acknowledgement of what they're going through.
No, absolutely. And so Grief Encounter as an organisation itself was founded by Dr. Shelley Gilbert off the back of her own complex loss.
Yes, I mean, Shelley is our founder. We're enormously honoured to work alongside her. She started Grief Encounter. This is our 20th year anniversary, and she turned her own experience of huge sorrow following the death of both her parents during her early childhood into a force for good for other children and young people. It was Shelley's lifelong mission to make sure that no child grieves alone, and she founded this charity and has delivered relentlessly to that mission over and over again, because she knows closer than anybody else the loneliness of living with the death of loved ones as a very young child.
It must be so complex dealing with grief in children, because when you think about how you evolve as a human being and how your perception of things and your emotions change over that period of time, from being a child to a teenager to 20s to 30s, everything changes. But when you're grappling with grief, that grief surely looks very different at each stage as well. So you're sort of dealing with something new, a new challenge every time you sort of move into the next phase of your development, surely.
I think that's one of the complications and very often misunderstood about the experience of a death in childhood. Actually, it's not the same as the experience of a death as an adult. The sorrow, the despair, the longing, those emotions that we all imagine and most of us have experienced, yes. But when you're a child and you don't have the language to express that, or you haven't developed the concept of understanding that something may never come back. All of those things are hugely complicating the grief process. So, for example, a child might think that daddy has gone, but they might expect him to come back if they're in their early years. Children who, as they grow up, there is a difference between being, say, under 5 and being 5 to 10 or in your teenage years. But those things, that grief may even change over time with your encroaching years, especially to do with how you engage with your friendship groups, how you cope when you go through transitions to new schools or to university, when other people are talking about family, and perhaps you want to avoid that situation. And we know that suppressing those emotions is not healthy, and if you do that long term, the outcomes can be extremely difficult. But the other thing for children and young people is they do experience death very often from friendship groups too. And that can be complicated because I think as a society we understand perhaps the impact of the death of a parent or even a sibling. But do we really give attention to those children who experience the death of a friend in school, maybe a death by suicide, which is so traumatic for anyone to have to cope with, but in your teen years particularly, and if it's a peer, what does that do to how you view the world and how you understand being able to look towards a hopeful future? Devastating.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about some of the more challenging, I mean, they're all challenging in their own way, but have you encountered any where you sort of got home from work that day and you thought, oh, that has totally knocked me for 6?
Yeah.
Like,
yes.
That was so traumatic.
Yes, I have. I think everyone's story is heart-wrenching. Everyone. I think if particularly you take into account how old was the child, but there are stories that are related to some of the more difficult deaths, such as death by suicide or death by a sudden, unforeseen, tragic accident, the death of a main carer, a mother or a father, where you know that they are highly likely to be something that need help to be able to navigate a life without them. But then there are other stories that sit within the incredulous that are just so upsetting. Of course, death by murder might be the most obvious ones, and we do work with a lot of children who have experienced tragedy in that way. But I think some of the tragic accidents, they never make sense. And I would also say that sometimes some people's stories might include nearly or a few of those factors, and sometimes nearly all of them. And those stories, well, you never forget them, ever. Because people sometimes say to me, well, how do families cope? And I often say, well, they don't have a choice. It's a forced change that they one day just find themselves facing. And that's why we have to be there to say, look, when you need help, we're here. And if you just need to talk, we will just talk to you. You don't need to ring up and ask us for therapy. You can just ring up and say, I'm not sure if I need help or not, and we will listen to you and we will have a conversation with you. It might not always be that we are the right people to help. That doesn't matter. There shouldn't be, if somebody asks for help, there shouldn't be this is not the right door. It should always be, we're here and we'll help get you the help that you need.
When I look back to my grandfather's story, he was 9 years old and his mother had been unwell for a little while. One night there was a bit of chaos. An ambulance came. He was just in his pajamas. It was the middle of the night. His mother got taken to hospital. And the next day, him and his siblings were taken to an orphanage. And nobody told them why. Like, ever. Obviously, after a period of time, he came to realise that his mother had passed away that night. And nobody broke the news to him that his mum wasn't coming back. It was just, it happened. And he spent a year in an orphanage and got a letter from his father saying, we'll come and get you soon. I've remarried. And because he just couldn't cope with 3 young children at that time and losing his wife. So they came home, same house, same bed, different woman. And that was it. No one ever had that conversation with him ever. That his mum had passed away. And he kind of helped raise his younger siblings. But this is the bizarre thing that I can't fathom. And I know that it was a different time. And he says, you know, maybe we weren't as bold to ask questions and speak out of turn. We wouldn't. But I think he just sort of had to lie there night after night in an orphanage. And eventually he realised, she's obviously gone. I've never heard anything since she was taken off in an ambulance.
Wow.
Which is wild. And I think what came from that, when I look at my grandfather, when he turned, I mean, even when he was 92, like, at the end of his life, he was in detail recounting situations with his mum where he felt guilt. Like, age 7, he didn't want the coat that she'd brought him when it was raining. So, you know, he kicked off a bit. And I said, why is this haunting you? If I look back at how I was with my mum, I couldn't even name them, but he was able to isolate every single thing he regretted because he'd lost his mum at the age of 9. And I just think he came out of it fine because he had to step up, be parent to 2 younger siblings. But then I don't think his siblings were fine when you look at sort of their paths. And I think that's tough to grapple with. So it kind of begs the question of how should parents be dealing with, or, you know, adults be dealing with educating young people about death? And should you be telling them about it before a loss has occurred? Or should you wait until a loss has occurred and then sit down and explain it in detail? Like, is there a point at which is the right time?
I think, I mean, first of all, thank you for sharing that story. What a tragic story. And I'd like to say that I don't hear examples like that. Still, probably not quite as brutal. But there are still stories where a child's parent has died and perhaps the child goes back to school and doesn't really talk to anybody about it again. And I do still, and it is some of the main emotions that children experience when they experience a death in childhood are, yes, fear and deep, profound sorrow and longing, but also worry and anxiety and so very often guilt. And for those children who have not been spoken to openly or clearly or consistently, they will probably have snippets of information that they then paste together to form some kind of rationale as to why did this happen. So your explanation of your grandfather feeling guilty about having kicked off, it's not a lovely story, but it's a very good illustration of what a child does. And there he's lived with that for his whole life, thinking, I feel guilty. Why did I do that? And children are just children. And, you know, very often, especially for tragic accidents, there's no explanation. And as adults around children, it's a good idea to be open and as honest with them about most things, really, but it is absolutely what is needed when they face the death of someone close in childhood, be that through a death where perhaps a parent has been diagnosed with a terminal illness, or through sudden tragic accident or despair. And the best thing to do is just to be clear about what's happened, stick to the facts, make sure that you don't avoid talking about the person that died, be sensitive to the child, be curious. If they kind of don't see themselves, ask, are you okay? Perhaps don't ask in the middle of the classroom. But do also mention the person that's died. Let the child have permission to talk about the person that has died, to talk out some of the things that they may be thinking about or worrying about. And very often those things, they just don't happen the day after or the week after a death. They can happen throughout their childhood and into adulthood, as your example explained. So as the adults around children, I think we should never underestimate the impact of what they might be carrying with them, not just from emotions, but what are they thinking about when perhaps they see someone who reminds them of their mother, and that might trigger them to have a guilt memory or a sudden memory of huge, deep sorrow. And I think as adults, it's very easy, and sometimes people still say to me even now, well, they were too young, or it was a long time ago, or, well, there's a blended family now where a parent has remarried and things are fine. I think, again, that is an underestimation of the impact of the death of someone close in childhood. That child will carry that experience, but they'll also carry the relationship with the dead person. There's a wonderful quote which tells us that the person might die, but the relationship never dies. And one of the most healing things to do is to make sure that you remember that relationship and you nurture it and you keep it alive, and encouraging children to talk about the person that's died, to share memories and feelings and stories will be healing.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, when our family dog passed away, my nephew was 3. And he was like, where's Hector? And he was alone with me, and I thought, oh, obviously this has fallen on me. This is a terrible job. Also, you don't want to upset the parents. So I just said, oh, Hector is very old, and he's gone to live in the sky. And he said, oh, when's he coming back?
Yeah. And
I said, no, he lives there now. That's his home. He's with your great-grandma and grandpa, and he's having a wonderful time. And then he was like, but I want him to come back. And I said, he can't. He's really, really, really happy, so we have to be happy for him as well. And I remember it was just like navigating that, and that's an animal, navigating that. But his understanding of it was so. I don't think people give enough credit to children.
No,
because even over a year later, he met his new head teacher for his new school. They said, "Do you have any pets?" 2, but one lives in the sky, he said. Yes. The teacher was like, what's he talking about? One of them passed away, and you just think to yourself, how do you even start that narrative with a child? You know, when they have no idea of a concept of death. And I told him, you know, when people get old, they can pass away. And then he was with my dad. My dad, he had like a couple of liver spots on his hand. And he said, what are those? And my dad said, oh, you just get them when you get a bit older. And he said, does it mean you're going to the sky? I thought, oh, what have I started here
Yes,
now?
yes.
Yeah, and he was like, no. And he said, but you said that's when you get old and you go to the sky when you go old.
Yes.
And I thought, I've opened a can of worms here.
Absolutely.
But
I think we're children really, well, all of us are surrounded by life and death all the time. Even we're approaching autumn now, and I always think it's a lovely time, the most beautiful colours, and the trees shed their leaves, and it's a different season for them. And children are experiencing that seasonal sense of life, growth, blossoming, and then perhaps getting older and dying. And great early years practitioners would say they're constantly talking to children about those kinds of seasons, noticing what happens, not just in plants, but even when you cook and you bake and you add all the ingredients together, you make a tremendous loaf and then you eat it and it's gone. And I think you're so right. So children are having those experiences of something being here and then something growing and then something being gone. And I think the most important thing we can do as adults is make sure we're clear about what we mean by when something has gone. And especially when it means about a person or a pet, that it means that they are not here, but it also means that they're not running about anywhere else. They're not hungry, they're not tired, their body has stopped working, they don't feel sick, they don't feel angry or sad or happy. Their body has stopped working and they're no longer with us in life as we know it. And if we can be just clear about that, about some of the more, not that pets are easy, they actually can be devastating. I know that from having my two dogs having died last year. But it is an opportunity to talk to children. I always think about the hamster. In our house, we always had hamsters. They don't live very long. And it was heartbreaking when my daughter lost her first hamster. But it was a good opportunity to let her bury the little hamster, think about the memories that she'd had. Emma, her name was, you see, I remember the hamster's name. She still talks about Emma to this day. And so those things are important, and we can start to establish really good, healthy routines about talking about death and dying.
It's definitely a complex one to deal with, for sure. And I think lots of parents want to do the right thing, but they're just not sure what's appropriate, what's not, what they should be doing. And
I think it makes people feel uncomfortable. And it's being able to sit with that discomfort and being able to think, well, perhaps this isn't my grief today, this is theirs. And what we hear children say to us all the time was that they stopped talking about the person that died because they didn't want to make other people feel uncomfortable. And that meant for them very often that they really suppressed their feelings, and they may have taken up other behaviours that felt soothing to them. And we very often see that where a significant grief has left unresolved, a young person may turn to riskier taking behaviours to self-soothe, say via alcohol, substance misuse, and even really in pursuing relationships that are perhaps not the right ones or the healthiest ones for them.
So it really is, I mean, it's scary because this one wrong turn can result in so much, which is what I was going to ask you next, is you must have worked with quite a few young people who are maybe in their late teens, early 20s, who experienced a death at a much younger age, but it was never dealt with, never talked about. What kind of behaviours have you seen, and what were the repercussions, sort of into that early adulthood stage of lives when they just never got the support they needed?
Yeah, I mean, there's quite a lot of research that has been done about this, and whilst you can't wholly attribute the death to everything, but because of course the child is living through their from their childhood through adult and experiencing all sorts of things. But I don't think you can underestimate the significance of, say, a death in childhood. And what we know from research is that all of the risks associated, say, with self-harm or suicide ideation, they go up. The risks associated with developing inappropriate relationships and even unhealthy relationships that we may call child sexual abuse, they go up. The risks associated with academic performance and poor performance, they go up. The risks of getting into employment at the right stage and pursuing a career, they go up. The risk of not doing that goes up too. So we know that unresolved, a death in childhood is likely to have a significantly adverse impact. And just living, we know, for example, from research that children are more likely to live with mental health difficulties. That might be depression. It might develop into more significant diagnoses of mental health problems. So it's a pretty bleak future if you don't develop those healthy lifestyles and healthy ways to manage your grief, and if the adults around you don't notice, don't acknowledge, and just think that you've dealt with it and moved on.
Yeah, I think that's the damaging thing, because you always remember these things. I think I told you when I first spoke to you, I went to school with a girl whose mother passed away, sadly, from a terminal illness. And I remember that it was a Wednesday when her mum passed away, and I was so horrified that this girl had lost her mum. We were 9 at the time, and I'm still to this day deeply attached to my mum. And so to me, when I heard what had happened, I was beyond horrified. Like, there's no way I would survive that. But I remember vividly her and her mum holding hands walking down the road. I mean, it was 9. And I remember her dying on a Wednesday. And I'm 34 now. I have never, ever, ever not felt a bit off on a Wednesday. Because in my head as a child, I just attributed Wednesdays to really bad things happen on Wednesdays.
Yeah.
So it's funny how you sort of pick these things up as a young child. And I wasn't even the one affected.
Yeah.
I didn't particularly know her mother.
Yeah.
But you pick up on these things.
Yeah,
and
I wonder what she attributes to a Wednesday. And some of that can be negative, but some of it can be positive, and thinking about at least perhaps on a Wednesday that she might remember her mother. I think for me, as the CEO of Grief Encounter, one of the things that I would say that I hear probably too often is that why does it matter if your mother or father died and you were only very young? Surely you don't know. And every time I hear or somebody says that to me, and sometimes it might be the child themselves who say that, who have perhaps grown up now and become an adult and says, I don't know why this is still affecting me, I was only 18 months or I was only just 2. Why would it matter? And actually it matters so much in your early childhood, because it's the time when you rely on the adults around you to keep you safe and warm. And I very often say, well, imagine, your mother is holding you tight and tucking you up into bed, and you're so used to her. You're used to how she smells and how she feels. And she's there. And when you cry, she's going to come. And she's probably going to come with just the right thing, your little blanket or your tummy or whatever it is that calms you down. And imagine one day that just isn't there. And that all of a sudden, when you cry, you don't know who's coming. And it certainly isn't the familiar smells and touches and noises and sounds that you're used to. And if, for example, that you have been forced into a change where you have to perhaps move houses too, not only do you then lose all of that familiarity of love and care, but you're also in unfamiliar surroundings, unfamiliar noises, unfamiliar context, and you're having to suddenly, as a child, very, very young child, when you cannot articulate your feelings, you haven't developed the language, all of that uncertainty and confusion and dismay is still happening. It's just you don't have the ability to express it, and very often it will come out in behaviours. In very young children, we might see a regression of behaviours. A child who perhaps was toilet trained might suddenly need to rely on the use of nappies because what people think, or they hypothesise, is that they're having to deal with such an enormous forced change that has caused an emotional impact that they just can't cope with carrying on, developing and exploring the world as if nothing has happened.
Yeah, I mean, that does make a lot of sense, because when you lose someone you love, time sort of stands still, and when you're an adult you don't notice it as much because you've sort of gone through the important parts of your development. But actually, if you look at a lot of people as an adult who are grieving, their world does stand still. They often, they can't socialise for however many months or years. They can't go into the office. They might have to leave their job. So time does stand still, and I think people don't really give enough. I don't think people really think enough about children and how that might affect them, because they too are probably just going to stop developing because you're sort of just caught in this grief. And that's in itself just so much to deal with. You can't possibly think about how you develop as a person and progress in life when you're totally flawed, you're in survival mode, essentially.
And you're in that state of forced change, and the adults around you have changed towards you. So that brings another dimension. It might be that the surviving parent, of course, is consumed with their own grief too, and is perhaps not so available when you need them, because they're consumed by their own sorrow. And as somebody generously said to me the other day, she said, I just used to say to my child, go and play. And, and children then perhaps attribute different things to the surviving adults' behaviour towards them. So perhaps a child does something that reminds the adult of the dead person, and the adult cries, and maybe it's something wonderful that the child has done, but the adult cries. The child then is left thinking, what have I done wrong? And so I think it's a much more complicated situation, as you said, that perhaps we don't give enough credence to, because thinking about it might cause us discomfort, but also, trigger in our own selves a sense of deep sorrow. And I think it's more than just sorrow. It's about, people often say to me, Suzy, why do you work with death and dying? And I always say, well, I don't actually. I work with people who are alive and living with the death of someone close. And that in a way almost brings the situation that people are having to navigate alive. And I think that what we do perhaps as a society is that we kind of don't want to look at it too much, because it's not the picture that we've built up of a kind of happy family, I don't know, out in the park having fun throwing the ball for the dog. And yet actually there are families out there who close the door, and there's a big hole, a big silence. The whole house has changed, the routine has changed, the roles have changed, and they're trying to work it out and trying to make sense of it at the same time, and trying to be mindful of each other's needs. And if you're a child in that, really however old, so difficult to work that through. And perhaps more so if you then can't turn to your friends who perhaps have not had that experience, and you feel so isolated because you are so very different to them.
Yeah, and there must be such a range of emotions, from sorrow, despair, but also just anger. I remember when my grandpa passed away. I don't know if I should admit this, but when my grandpa passed away, he was 92. He had an amazing, amazing life. But I found myself, if I was ever around other people's grandparents, I'd say, oh, how old are they? Oh, they're 94. I think, what did they do to deserve that? And I think to myself, mine was way better. Why did mine go at 92? But then you think, life doesn't work like that. They don't just rank you on how great of a person you are and then pick off the ones that are less great and go like that. And I found myself getting into this very dark hole of making comparisons and getting really, really, really angry when I saw people's elderly grandparents. And why them? And it must be the same for kids when they go around and play at their friends' houses, and they're with the friend's mum. They must think to themselves, it's just so deeply unfair. Why can't I do this? There are so many things that I'm not going to be able to do with my mum.
I think anger is one of the big emotions that we see, and you're so right. You feel angry as an adult when there's a death, even if it's a death by natural causes and after a long-lived healthy life. But when there are complications, of course, anger is going to come out, but it might not come out in that kind of linear fashion where you're able to articulate that feeling of, injustice. For a child, it might just come out as very angry, not wanting to play, hitting out at another child, perhaps not concentrating on their schoolwork, kicking the desk, those kind of things. And I think as the adults around children, we need to be curious about their anger, particularly after the death of someone close in childhood, because maybe there's something there that is something that they can't express. Maybe something has happened that has reminded them of the dead person and the injustice, and maybe they just feel really angry because why me, why my mum, why my dad, why my friend, what did I do wrong? And I think that anger, just like any other emotions, we have a right to express our emotions, and we have a right to expect people around us to be able to understand and acknowledge and help us express them perhaps in more positive ways that perhaps don't hurt others, but nonetheless sit with the discomfort, that anger, and work it through. I remember that when my friend's brother died. I think I remember to this day the overwhelming sense of anger. He was 19, and I saw a group of young people standing on the street corner smoking, and this is a true story. And I went up to them and said, in a very angry way, what are you doing that for? You have a choice. You have a choice not to do something that can affect your life and may cause you to die. But my friend didn't. He just got cancer and died. To this day, I feel so bad about that because they were just, I didn't even know them, but the anger just spilt out, It spilt out, and I just think that, and I wasn't particularly old, I was 20, but when you're a child, anger is going to spill out, and it's going to spill out in all sorts of ways and in a way that you can't articulate it. And if we can just sit with that for a bit and be curious about it and think, I wonder why you kicked little Johnny. I wonder if you were thinking of Dad. That might help children be able to acknowledge their own emotions and think to themselves, or it might open a conversation with the adults around them about Dad and help them cherish a memory.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone said to me recently, actually, I mean, I've heard this a lot of times. I do not like this term at all, but someone said to me recently, time heals all wounds. And I sat with that for a second and I thought, that's just not true, because grief is not linear. It is not, it's not a situation where a certain amount of time passes by and things get easier and better. I think most people, have experienced some sort of grief, will know that you could go a month, 2 months being absolutely fine, and then suddenly you're just walking around a shopping centre and suddenly it feels like a 10-ton truck has just driven into your stomach. You can't breathe and you think, I don't actually think I can make it to tomorrow with this grief. And it doesn't make sense to so many people because they think, but it's been 2 years. You've made it all of these days. But in that moment you think, I don't think that I can do this. I don't think I can weather this one through. And you do, but it comes back around again. And I think it's going to be an awful lot healthier to change that narrative of time heals all wounds, because sometimes it does, but sometimes it doesn't. And I think giving people a realistic view on what that journey might look like might actually, in a way, help people a little bit, so that they're not standing there 4 years in, absolutely shocked why they can't see light at the end of the tunnel suddenly, because that's just not the way it goes. You're going to have different stages in life, and I just think it's a really unhealthy narrative.
I mean, some people, I think that's an example that some people would share that might be triggering for them, that might trigger an angry response, because perhaps for them it feels like it might be 20 years on, 60 years on sometimes, but it still feels the same as if the day it happened. And I had a conversation with someone recently who shared with me that he felt that really when you experience the death of someone close, time takes on an entirely new dimension. It both carries on and stands still, that you are both moving forward because you're in a situation of forced change and you're having to live your day, having to get up, but you feel like you're standing still. And you don't want to let go, because you don't want to let go of the person or the memories or even the feelings associated with the event that happened. And that's some of the complications of it. And I think you've kind of touched on something that as a society we do have some of those cliches. Time's a healer. Time does go on, and people do feel perhaps not so overwhelmed by the grief, but the size and shape of their grief, it never changes. And anything that is triggering can take them straight back to that event. And there's a lot been written about this and about what we would call in academic terms the dual process, where what people are actually trying to do is they're trying to live with loss, that huge, profound sense of loss and longing, as well as try to rebuild a life without the person that has died. And so time is just a new concept. I'm not saying that people don't experience positive things as the consequence of some of the most tragic of circumstances, and indeed our founding patron, Kevin Wells, whose daughter died in the Sower murders. He said to me, please do tell people that grief can have positive consequences. It can be transformational for all of the wrong reasons. We know that, we accept that, we acknowledge that, but things can happen that can change lives, and really that perhaps is more important to hang on to, because that sense of hopelessness is overwhelming. And what we try to do in Grief Encounter, sensitively, carefully help people find hope and healing.
A last little piece of advice, with your breadth of experience, it will be helpful. What tangible advice can you give to a parent or an adult who is trying to help a young person navigate grief? What kind of, it's just happened or it's recently happened. What advice would you give to them?
Keep the memory of the person that died alive. Talk about them. Think about them together. Tell stories about them. Keep that memory alive, not just in a photograph beside the bed, but if you're watching, an episode of Modern Family, look at what that's happened there. Does that remind you of? When you're going out experiencing something new, what would Daddy or Mummy think about this? Would they have liked it? Laugh about the individual as well as cry about the individual. Think about them as a whole person. Think about what made them fun. Think about what made them not so fun. Use their name. That would be one of the biggest pieces of advice, I would say. When I say to people, well, tell me the name of the person that died, 99.9% of the time, they will say the name of the person, their whole face lights up. They may have had tears streaming down their face, their whole face lights up. So be confident to keep the memory of the person alive, and be curious about changes in behaviour. Don't just stay away from it because it's making you feel a bit uncomfortable, or you think you're going to say the wrong thing. You probably will say the wrong thing. That is kind of linked to that anger, because there isn't a totally right thing, because everybody's different, everybody is unique, everybody grieves in a different way. So kind of be curious and courageous to talk to the person, and to do that for longer than just after the event.
Yes.
To always do it.
I think that's the key thing, isn't it? It never goes away, and the conversation should never stop either.
No.
Well, thank you so much, Suzy, for the advice and your journey. And thank you so much for all your help and work.
Thank you.
I'll put a link in for Grief Encounter
Thank you very much.
The episode notes. So if anyone needs support for a young one in their lives, then they can just click on the website.
Thank you very much.
Thanks,
we need
Suzy.
all the support we can get. Thank you.